Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
The psychology behind good and bad decision making isn't just fascinating for those of us who are interested in human behavior and sociology. It's also important for recruiting and HR leaders who are interested in making better decisions and better investments when it comes to their human capital investment, whether you are hiring for a new workforce or adding to an existing one. It doesn't matter if you're in finance, HR, or wherever in the workplace, complacency is a huge roadblock to success. I want to say a special thank you to our podcast sponsor, Clear Company. Today I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Crosby, a behavioral finance expert and thought leader on market psychology. He is the Chief Behavioral Officer at Brinker Capital and the author of a new book, The Behavioral Investor. Daniel, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Thank you. Awesome to be here.
First, let's talk a little bit about your background and how you got here.
Yeah, it's a long and winding road, I think, which is the case with many of the folks that listen to your podcast, I imagine. But I'm a clinician by training. I'm a clinical psychologist by education, but decided about 3 years into that endeavor that I was not set up for being a doctor for meeting with 40 sad people every week. It was just something that I was bringing home from work in a pretty big way. Every weekend I was stressed out, worrying about my clients and, worrying if people would be there the next Monday. And so I pivoted as soon as I got out of school and started looking for non-clinical applications of psychology, which led me to the world of work and leadership and organizational development, which is where our paths crossed, and did that for a couple of years. But in that process, became aware of this field of behavioral economics and behavioral finance. And having grown up the son of a financial advisor, was instantly smitten with it, and spent the last 7 or 8 years trying to bring the sometimes ivory tower world of behavioral economics down to everyday folks from Alabama like myself.
So for those of you who are listening here, I've known Dan for, 9 years maybe, a while,
Yeah.
and we met on Twitter, and then we met in person at a number of conferences and events, and so our careers have sort of paralleled one another, so it's been kind of fun to watch our families grow up and then our businesses go in different directions.
Yeah. Lots of great people that I miss a lot in that world of HR and recruiting and OD. So wonderful community.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your book. And I know that your book focuses on decision making and investing, but I thought that we could also apply that decision making to really any industry. So can you kind of talk us through what drives your focus on behavioral psychology and then what drives human behavior in just decision making in general?
Yeah, so the investing piece is, I think, not the most interesting piece of this. I'm not all that interested in investing, to be quite honest, which is a funny thing to say for a guy that's written 3 books on investing. But the only thing that I really like about capital markets is they give us a real-time indication of sentiment and emotion and how people are thinking. And it's sort of this real-time Rorschach test for how people are thinking and behaving. So I don't find investing to be interesting per se, and was much more interested in the 4 sort of pillars of decision-making that I know we'll talk about today. But I wanted to get down to the root of, there's hundreds and hundreds of different biases that psychologists like myself have identified that shows how sort of screwed up and funny our errors are and our cognitive biases are. But I wanted to dig a little deeper in this book and see what are the handful or 2 handfuls that underpin those hundreds of biases. Because when I began to dig into the research, I was like, look, this is, these are all sort of individual manifestations of a common theme. And so, yeah, started with about 200 and worked my way down to four different primary ways that we make decisional errors.
Well, but before we get to those four decisional errors, let's talk a little bit more about the book. You talk about how our brains, our bodies, and society in which we live kind of conspire to make poor decisions, or to make us, I guess, poor decision makers. Can you talk about these factors and how they impact our work?
Yeah, so I felt like the psychological pieces needed to be grounded in the physical context. So, I'll touch on each of these briefly. Our brains haven't had an upgrade in like 200,000 years. When we look at the brains, or the skulls rather, of our ancient ancestors, nothing's changed in 150 plus thousand years. And so we've got brains that in evolutionary time are not that old, but when it comes to trying to handle the demands that are placed on us by capital markets or the modern world of work or social media, we're working with brains that were made for a different time and place. And in particular, they're wired for immediacy. We are living longer and longer. We're having to put together a 40 and 50-year work career, maintain lots of relationships, and we're basically wired to survive on the savannas of Africa. And so I talk a lot in the book about how, look, your brain is a marvel. Your brain is a marvel that's unparalleled by anything else, anything we can do with AI or anything to this point. But on the other hand, it was a marvel that was made for a different time and place. So, capital markets are 400 years old. Your brain's 200,000 years old. There's a pretty significant mismatch. And, the other thing that I talk about in the book is that your brain is, 2% of your body weight, but it accounts for 25 to 40% of all the calories you spend in a given day. So your brain is always looking for ways to shut down or do less work. And one of the ways that we do this is we rely on other people, we take shortcuts, we stereotype, we think in biased ways, and all of these things lead us to make sort of lazy decisions out of this sense of immediacy rather than this long-term thinking that we have to be about today.
Interesting. I guess I never thought of it that way, that these biases that exist are just ways for your brain to save energy and not work so hard.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They refer to them as heuristics, which is basically just, a rule of thumb or a shortcut. And so, yeah, your brain is always looking to do less work because it's so sort of mismatched with the amount of energy that it takes up. And, some of the lazy thinking and stereotypical bias thinking that we do is just because of this.
Well, you mentioned four primary psychological errors that result in poor decision making. Can you kind of talk us through a little bit more about those?
Yeah, so the first of these is ego, which is overconfidence. So overconfidence, and it must be said that the research says that men are far more overconfident than women. This is a bigger problem for guys than women for sure. But overconfidence is consistent with the other themes of the book, something that has served us well evolutionarily, but something that serves us poorly at work. So for a very, very long time, overconfidence has made us resilient. It's made us, get back on the horse when we had a defeat. It's made us, get up and keep trying again. But it also leads us to think of ourselves as, sort of infallible, invincible. We think that we can be more precise about the future than we are. We think that we can, that we're better than other people. We think that we're luckier than other people and more talented than other people. I talk in the book about people's performance. In this case, it's their trading performance, but you could analogize it to their performance at work, I think, pretty quickly. And you ask people who thought that they had outperformed the market, to write down how well they had done. And most of them got it wrong, and many of them got it, massively wrong, 3-4 standard deviations off. So we don't view our performance the way that it really exists. And so you think about that in the world of work, and you think about the studies that have shown that your coworkers are, better predictors of your performance and your preferences at work than you are. And we see all of ourselves through this glass darkly because of this ego or this overconfidence, which on the one hand gets us out of bed in the morning, but on the other hand makes us kind of insufferable once we do get out of bed. So the second piece there is emotion. And, this goes back to what we talked about before. Emotion is one of the first heuristics, one of these first rules of thumb by which we make decisions. And so emotion has been sort of this risk tolerance guide for us throughout human history. And it's good in a lot of ways. Like, one of the things that I show in the book is that every decision has an emotional undercurrent. And people who have the emotional processing centers of their brains damaged can't even make simple decisions about, what to have for breakfast or what color suit to put on. So every decision has this emotional undercurrent, and yet all of the research shows that when an emotion is at its extremes, we make really, really poor decisions. And so we have to sort of balance. You have to sort of walk this line to say, look, emotion enters in. I get that, but if I'm in an emotional extreme, I need to take a step back and maybe put this decision off. The third of these variables is what I call attention, which is our tendency to confuse things that are vivid with things that are likely. And so, a good example of this I give in the book is after the World Trade Center, after September 11th, 3,000 people died in that tragedy, and we, rightly mourn the loss of those 3,000 lives on that day. But over the next couple of months, another 1,600 people lost their lives because they chose to drive rather than fly. Like, everyone was scared of flying in the aftermath of 9/11, and so driving was at all-time highs because everyone was driving for 10 hours instead of where they would have otherwise taken a flight. And so, thousands of people died in car accidents that year, thousands more than do on a normal year. And it's this example that, just because something big and improbable happened, and we base our decisions around this big, improbable, memorable thing, and not on averages. So I'm a big proponent in all business contexts for looking at base rates and averages and looking at, kind of going by the numbers. And then finally is conservatism, which I know is sort of the bane of HR folks everywhere, which is this idea that we should keep doing things the way they've always been done. Because when your brain is kind of overloaded, one of the easiest things you can do is just do things the way they've always been done, and that's the status quo bias at work.
All this is, I think, really good to kind of give us some context into decision making and how we can maybe help increase our own self-awareness as we're realizing that these biases and maybe poor decision making exists and we don't really even know what's happening. What do you think HR and recruiters should be doing in order to improve their own decision making processes?
So I think one of the things that I suggest early on in the book is totally applicable to the world of human resources. And it's understanding that you are just as prone to these errors in decision making and thinking as the next person. One of my worries in writing books like this is that people will read it and go, oh, wow, that's just like my friend, or that's just like my neighbor, when the real purpose of a book like this is to be used introspectively to say, wow, this is just like me. And your ownership and your realization that you fall prey to these biases is the ceiling for how well you'll get at circumventing them. So that would be sort of my base case to say, look, if you read a book like mine, I hope you look at this with an eye pointed at your own behavior to say, why do I do the things that I do? Where could I get better? Because, in my book, a lot of it's to do with money, and, money's not nothing. But in the world of HR, it's even higher stakes because your errors in decision making and thinking impact the lives of real human beings. You're not hiring someone because of some blind spot you have, and that's personally catastrophic.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast sponsored by Clear Company. We're talking about the behavioral science behind decision making with Dr. Daniel Crosby. He's a behavioral finance expert and an old friend.
Podcast support provided by Clear Company, a complete talent management platform designed to help small and medium-sized companies hire, retain, and engage A players. Visit clearcompany.com to sign up for a free personalized demo.
I think that behavioral research seems to offer a lot in terms of what you're doing with investment, but I also think of human capital investment, right? So how can we maybe use some of the things that you've outlined to kind of develop maybe a risk-benefit analysis when we're hiring or choosing to develop or better engage our workforces?
So I think one of the big mistakes that people make in making hiring decisions and coaching decisions and people development decisions is in thinking that people are static and that they kind of, bring this immutable self around everywhere they go. When all of the research shows that we are highly, highly situationally dependent. So in my last book, two books ago, The Laws of Wealth, I give this example of people who are shopping at a liquor store, and this liquor store was having trouble titrating the levels of beer versus champagne. And they couldn't sort of manage the flow of alcohol to see what they should be stocking. So they tried this experiment where they played French music on some days and German music on other days to see if they could induce people to make better or to buy more beer or champagne. And on the German music days, people bought 50%, more than 50% more German beer. On the French music days, people bought like 77% more champagne than average. And if you ask someone who's leaving, the package store why they bought, beer or champagne, not a single one of them will say, I was subtly influenced by cues in my environment, but that's exactly what happened. And so I think that people who set up workplaces have to understand that, people are, there's a core to people. They have some things in common, but the place that you're providing them, the culture, right? The culture, the environment, the physical environment, the place that you're bringing them to has as much to do with their behavior as the person themselves. So I think there's a lot that can be learned by HR and OD and other professionals about how to set up teams, how to set up workplaces, how to set up compensation packages that bring the best out of people, because people are more variable than I think we tend to give credence to, and workplaces can go a long way towards bringing the best out of people and not scapegoating the people when things go wrong.
When I think about decision making, metrics are a really important part of that. I guess I'm having a hard time thinking about like turnover metrics, or some sort of other like cost per hire, how those decisions, like we look at these metrics and we say, okay, my cost per hire is a little high. I'm going to make some maybe decisions to cut some budget. That seems really logical, but you just said earlier that our decisions are emotional. So how can we help, I guess, or remove or lessen that emotion? Because it just seems simple, like, this number's high, let's make some adjustments. Can you kind of maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, so systematizing a process using good metrics is, I think, the answer. Now, it's the answer, but I don't think it's a simplistic answer, and it's one that still deserves some thought. Because by automating a process, as we've seen with AI and other solutions, you can also automate bias. So, you have to look at, I think you have to look at the numbers, but also look at the theory behind the numbers. I think that's one of the things that I learned to do when I trained with my PhD in psychology. I think people who sometimes just know enough to be dangerous about analytics or statistics will go, oh, well, the numbers say what the numbers say. That's not the kind of thing you hear from anyone who's much of a scientist, because even numbers, tell stories. Even numbers can be fudged. Even numbers can be manipulated or interpreted. And so I think we need to systematize processes. I think we need good analytics, as you've said. But I think we also, have to ask ourselves philosophical and theoretical questions that get to the root and say, are we getting the right results for the right reason? And are we being the kind of organization that we need to be? So, balancing that focus on numbers with a focus on, heart and philosophy, I think is important. And, you can take a lot of the emotion out of a decisional process if you automate it, but just make sure you're automating it the right way, I think.
I like what you said here, automating bias. And I think that we're starting to see more of these situations pop up where the algorithm that we've built, and I mean collective we, actually has a bias baked in, and then they've built this algorithm for hiring or for investment or some sort of algorithm, and even for like picking what Uber drivers are going to be picking up which people, right? Looking back, you can see maybe that it was there. So I feel like a good process, but maybe a lot of different types of people with different experiences involved in the development of that process or algorithm, whichever it may be, might help eliminate some of that bias that is sort of baked in.
Yeah, and you have to be one of the things that proliferates in our society and the culture of work as data proliferates is spurious correlations. There's this famous study on capital markets about how there's a 96% correlation between the production of butter in Bangladesh and movements in the S&P 500. Now, should you invest your money? Should you make buy and sell decisions based on the production of Bangladeshi butter? Like, you should not, because it's nonsensical. So, like, even though there's data to support an idea, it again has to have some sort of philosophical heft to it for it to make any sense. And I think we need to do that in the world of work too, because as we get more and more information about how people are working, and we regress it against millions of other variables, some stuff is going to pop up and it's going to be dumb, or it's going to be racist, or it's going to be bad-hearted or whatever. So we have to use data for sure, but we have to use our heads as well.
You recently started in a new position. You're the Chief Behavioral Officer at Brinker Capital. Can you maybe talk about the work that you do there, and then the decision-making process you went through to make the decision to join the organization?
Yeah, so Brinker had been my biggest client for 6 or 7 years. So a big part of my decision was based on knowing who they were and trusting them and having there be this mutual trust and having them understand, basically that I was still this sort of free-spirited entrepreneurial guy. I mean, most 9-to-5 W-2 employment would suit me very poorly. And we did something that I encourage, that I talk about in my book, and I would encourage anyone considering a new job to do, is to do what's called a pre-mortem. We talk in the world of work about doing this post-mortem, which is, if a project goes wrong, we sit around a table and go, well, what happened? But you can get a lot more benefit out of doing a pre-mortem. And so what I did with Brinker is we sat down and they said, look, you're this kind of entrepreneurial big ideas guy who's maybe hard to pin down a bit. If you're not working here in 1 year, if you've left us, if this engagement has fizzled out in 6 months or a year, why will it have fizzled out? And, you sort of anticipate the undesirable end before you get there. And so I was able to say, well, it would probably be because I was traveling too much and away from my family, or I wasn't given, appropriate compensation, or wasn't given appropriate freedom of expression, or didn't have the chance to pursue ideas that would scale, or, whatever it was. You can anticipate that undesirable end from the beginning and then take pains to prevent it. And so that's good. I mean, that's good for that's good for everything. That's good for, before you make a hire. That's good before you get married. I firmly believe that this overconfidence is a big reason why divorce is so high. If people sat down on their wedding day and said, hey, person I love, well, there's a 50% chance that we're going to get divorced. Like, what are we gonna, what are we going to do about it? I think we'd have better rates of staying together. So, yeah, great company. But the pre-mortem was what really helped me think through whether or not we could come up with a package that would work for both parties.
I love it. And I love this book because not only will it appeal to maybe your finance guy or gal and other senior business leaders, and it's on the subject of investment, but it's really about decision making. Investment is part of it, but like you said, it's decision making overall, which hopefully they'll not only get good ideas into investment decisions, but just all investments, people, life choices, and hopefully, just being a better human being and living a happier life.
Agreed.
Daniel, where can people go to learn more about you and the book and what you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm super active on LinkedIn, just Daniel Crosby, PhD. I'm on Twitter at Daniel Crosby, and I have my own podcast called Standard Deviations. So those are the best places.
That is like the wittiest title I have ever heard. I love it. I love it.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to catch up with you again soon.
Okay, great to be here. Thank you.
Are you an HR leader who's looking to upscale your HR game? Check out Workology's Learn, an on-demand learning platform anytime, anywhere for individuals and teams. Visit workology.com/learn. Daniel uses background in behavioral science and psychology to help companies make better investment decisions. And his research on how we make decisions can help us have better judgment for making the difficult calls we have to do so frequently in HR and recruiting. It's fascinating to me to understand the science behind this human behavior, but also the self-awareness can help us be better leaders. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, sponsored by Clear Company. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.